Welcome back to the third video in our educational series. Before we dive into today's topic, let's recap what we've covered so far because it is important to have that proper context before we jump into what we're going to talk about today. So in the first video, we broke down Bitcoin's actual value proposition. I was trying to explain that Bitcoin isn't just about number go up and that this fixation on fixed supply or only 21 million coins ever going to exist is naive. It's really about what's going to create demand for the chain long term, right? Speculation will net out to zero over a long enough time frame and it will become boring. But it's really this censorship resistant, trustless settlement layer that matters. This demand for permissionless money is what drives price long term. That's the entire point of Bitcoin. So we explained how Bitcoin achieves this decentralized, trustless settlement layer through decentralized consensus. And we concluded that only economic, active, participating nodes matter. Then we showed what naturally emerges out of this is a market for confirmations, where transactions are prioritized by the fee level. And that brought us to the second video where we basically explored Bitcoin's scalability and eventually concluded that it isn't scalable. A single Bitcoin doesn't scale. The reason for that is that as demand rises, so does the cost of using it. This is unique to Bitcoin. It hasn't ever existed in a money before, and that's why I think it's so misunderstood, despite so much evidence to the contrary. So we walked through basically the two sides of the scaling debate from 2017 and explained why both were flawed. And we concluded that Bitcoin doesn't scale vertically. Instead, it will scale horizontally, meaning through multiple implementations of the Bitcoin technology. And that's sort of the market's natural process of substitution and how the value prop of permissionless money is scaling and will continue to do so into the future. So that leads us into today's topic, which is the rise of the second Bitcoin chain. This, if you're new, probably seems like an unheard of phenomenon because in the speculative market, almost nobody's talking about it. To be honest, nobody's going to watch this video except the people that already follow me. But maybe in the future, once this becomes common sense, it will attract attention. So it seems like a new phenomenon, but to anyone actually paying attention to what's going on the real monetary demand side of this market, again, that's what drives price long term. It shouldn't be a new phenomenon. We first saw this happen in 2017 where fees rose on the Bitcoin blockchain when block space became full and certain transactions were priced out of the chain. Alternatives naturally emerged, but among those alternatives, there's only one that has consistently absorbed excess demand over the last 8 years and now has such a substantial lead that the odds of it continuing are very high. But first, to put this into proper context, I think it's really helpful to review the history of Bitcoin, how the market's developed over time, to understand how we've gotten to where we are at today. This historical growth of both the speculative and monetary demand side of this market is insightful if you're new to the space, and it puts you into the right frame of mind to understand what I'm going to say. So let's start with a brief overview of Bitcoin's historical monetization path, and then we'll dive into more of the details in a second here on the next slide. So Bitcoin sort of started with this monetary adoption phase from 2009 to 2014. It was really led by cypherpunks, libertarians, and people actually using it for censorship-resistant payments. Then it shifted in 2015 to 2017, where we saw the rise of these retail-facing exchanges like Coinbase and Binance. They were small at first, but really attracted a lot of users out of price going up. And the market was so small relative to that capital that now had access that prices went insane. And then from 2017 to 2025, Bitcoin's monetary growth has plateaued. Right? There isn't that much demand at the higher value range for Bitcoin payments, at least not evident yet. That really it's struggled to increase on the monetary network effect side. Instead, we've seen it lose monetary dominance to competition. So let's get into the more specific details here. Bitcoin 2009 to 2014, which is what I would refer to as its first monetary adoption phase. So in 2010, we had the first evidence of price discovery where somebody bought 10,000 Bitcoin for 2 pizzas. Then in 2011, address growth went from 10,000 active addresses a day to over 1 million by 2013. The first most prominent real monetary growth aspect came on the platform Silk Road. So this was one of the first merchants. And then we saw companies that people were familiar with like Newegg, Dell, Microsoft accepting Bitcoin during that time. On-chain transactions, basically from inception to then, went from 0 to tens of thousands per month by 2013. And then 2014 really was the development of the first exchanges. Really was Magic the Gathering, where people could trade Bitcoin. It developed and failed. But it was really the organic, real value prop of Bitcoin that drove demand and price higher. So it's important to understand that because it hasn't always been driven by speculation. Yes, speculation naturally comes when a new technology is emerging, but really Bitcoin was competing against all other monies in the world at that time, and it offered something unique to the marketplace that hadn't existed before, and that's why the price rose. Now let's jump into Bitcoin 2015 to 2017. This is really when the speculative era began. So like I said before, these consumer retail facing exchanges, Coinbase and Binance, kind of opened the floodgates for retail speculation. Then we had the rise of Ethereum, ICO mania, which was like print your own token. That was the first platform to do that, and that brought in millions and millions of people. Some of these ICOs raised billions of dollars. Ended up doing nothing with it, but that's besides the point. Bitcoin's price rose from $1,000 to $20,000 in this crazy speculative bubble. But that was really the defining characteristic, I think, of this speculative cycle was giving retail people access to buy coins, and it was global. So this market just exploded, not on real monetary growth, but on people just buying coins indiscriminately. Then we had the futures launch in late 2017, and that was kind of the beginning of the institutional speculation phase. And we've been in that since 2017 till today. So we can go through these key points here. In 2020, MicroStrategy was acquiring Bitcoin. I remember seeing this on chain. Somebody was buying a ton of Bitcoin after the COVID crash. I could see it from on-chain movements, a ton of Bitcoin being accumulated. Then Tesla bought in the 2021 cycle, and Square also drove demand. And then in 2024, after the macro conditions kind of aligned for reinflation, we had an ETF launch that's driven demand. Really, we've seen individuals net selling to institutional types. So these corporate treasuries, ETFs, and companies like Michael Saylor's strategy. But despite the growth and speculation on Bitcoin, it's actually seen a relative decline in its monetary market share dominance. And now the most recent speculation is governments that are announcing Bitcoin reserve potential, right? They're potentially adding Bitcoin to their reserves. I think they don't really understand what Bitcoin is, and it's kind of a result of price going up and people getting excited about it. But now let's compare that history. So the important conclusion I make from Bitcoin's growth since inception is that it started from real monetary adoption, right? It started with this grain of truth that it was the first decentralized censorship-resistant money. And then speculation grew out of that to the most extreme kind of absurd bubble we live in right now. And I want to contrast that to Litecoin's growth over the past 14 years since launch. So Litecoin was launched by Charlie Lee in 2011. It was under the narrative of being silver to Bitcoin's gold. And I think that narrative still holds weight today, although it's not the perfect way to compare Litecoin to Bitcoin. But anyways, it was marketed primarily as that. And then from 2011 to 2014, we saw price rally basically from $0 to $40, but this was just on speculation alone. There was no reason for another Bitcoin chain to see adoption, usage, monetization in a time when Bitcoin was still free to use, right? Until Bitcoin blocks are full, it's going to be nearly impossible for a substitute Bitcoin chain or second Bitcoin chain to get off the ground. So in 2014, 2015, Litecoin was still struggling to find demand. 2016, it was thought to be irrelevant because honestly it was up until that point. Then in 2017, we started to see some active development on Litecoin. So Bitcoin was trying to activate SegWit. The community was scared about it, so Litecoin was used as this test net for Bitcoin because it actually held real value, and it proved successful in Litecoin. Nobody was able to hack the SegWit address. So it actually helped Bitcoin grow back then. Then, because it was one of the few assets listed on Coinbase, a lot of people just indiscriminately bought Litecoin, even though Bitcoin was like 400x ahead of Litecoin in terms of actual monetary growth. But mid-2017, Bitcoin experienced that first congestion phase where block space was full and fees started to rise. And that's where Litecoin first saw evidence of monetary organic growth. It started to steal Bitcoin's market share. Again, it's really hard for a substitute chain to get off the ground because it's doing the exact same thing Bitcoin is. The only reason you'd need a second Bitcoin chain is if the cost of using the first is too high. And it will struggle to gain price because it's being monetized at the low value range. It's hard to get people to shift their behavior. Like even if Bitcoin fees go to $5, $10, the vast majority of people will just wait or transact at that price range. You really have to price them out where fees start to become significant to their transaction sizes before they're going to switch. But once they switch, network effects are sticky. Sorry to interject there, but in 2018 through 2025, really we've seen massive growth on the monetary demand side for Litecoin, while the monetary demand side for Bitcoin is plateauing. And that's because fees have been consistently high enough to make Bitcoin, BTC, unusable. And so Litecoin's gone from, really it was 2K a day in early 2017 in transactions to 200K plus a day today. Notable developments were that Litecoin surpassed Bitcoin in payment counts on BitPay. It's seen the largest relative market share increase across all global crypto payment processors, right? So it's not just happening on BitPay in the US, it's happening on CoinGate and BitRefill, the two other largest payment processors. Another notable development really during the last few years is that Litecoin implemented this privacy layer called Mimblewimble extension blocks. This is the one area I feel that Bitcoin struggles with if it's going to actually succeed on it delivering its value prop long term. Privacy is essential if you're going to try to resist the state's monopoly control over money. So to conclude this development of Litecoin, basically I want to show that it's inverse to what's been happening with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin started out growing from real organic monetary adoption, and then speculation has taken over, where the only path for growth now for Bitcoin to go to higher prices is larger pools of capital speculating on BTC. And then Litecoin started out the exact opposite, on speculation alone. There was no need for it on the monetary side. So it went from $0 to $40, a $1 billion market cap, on just speculation, kind of like a meme coin. And then it struggled. Even though monetary adoption has increased significantly, but it's so tough for something to overcome that negative reflexivity, right? People still think Litecoin is useless because it hasn't gone anywhere in price, right? And the longer it goes sideways, the more people give up, capitulate, and chase Bitcoin. And Bitcoin's going up for the positive reflexivity reasons, right? People see 100% year-over-year growth. They're like, oh, I want to own Bitcoin over anything else. So it's really tough to for both of these assets to break out and reflect the most likely future, just because of historical bias. So we've concluded and kind of gained some insight as to how both of these markets for Bitcoin and Litecoin have developed over the years, and hopefully that provides some context. The next topic that I want to explore here is what I refer to as monetary consolidation. I don't know if this is a legit term used in economics, but it's what I think makes most sense. So naturally, markets gravitate towards a single money because exchange costs between monies are friction. They're a cost to the user. If one money is dominant and cheap to use, there's really no reason to use another money, right? That's just friction. The dominant money will have greater utility because it has more users on the network, and therefore it's more valuable. It's nearly impossible for anything to compete with it. But what's unique about Bitcoin is cost rises with demand, forcing either substitution or disuse. What we've seen happen is substitution driving growth of Litecoin. And the important point to understand here is that the same monetary consolidation that happened around the first Bitcoin chain, BTC, will happen around the second and is happening around the second. So if demand for Bitcoin's value proposition continues, permissionless money, naturally we'll see Litecoin see the same consolidation and move up into higher value ranges. It's already separated from the pack, but its lead should multiply from here because of those network effects. So now let's jump into the supporting evidence of what I just talked about here, how Litecoin's establishing itself against the rest of the market, at least within the sector that Litecoin competes in, which is permissionless money. First, we'll show here, this is data from BitInfo charts. It just shows public blockchain data. What's really important here is that we make sure that this transaction data has integrity, meaning it's real. It's very confusing in cryptocurrency markets because there's so much speculative activity happening that we want to discern what's real and sustainable long term versus what's speculative and will eventually go to zero. So BitInfo charts here shows Bitcoin, Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash, and Dogecoin. What we see here is Litecoin doing about 200,000 transactions a day versus Bitcoin's 370,000. Median transaction values for Litecoin have remained at around $200 since 2017. And that tells me, or at least gives me a little bit of confidence that this is being monetized for real payments for real goods and services. Whereas if you compare to Bitcoin Cash or Dogecoin, right, median transaction values at 16 cents or 2 cents, that means a lot of those transactions are either fake or they're for doginals, ordinals, runes type activity, the speculative stuff. And yes, all of these chains have coins being sent to and from exchanges. We live in a casino honeymoon phase type market, so naturally a certain portion. But as we go through this data, we'll show you why most of that transaction data on Litecoin is actually real and organic. So the first chart here is Litecoin total transactions over time. And we reviewed the history, so this should make sense. From 2017 to 2025, really we've seen up and to the right growth in transaction activity for Litecoin. Because the median transaction values are about the same, we're confident that most of this activity is organic. And on the next slide, I'll show you what we just talked about. This is Bitcoin fee level in yellow versus Litecoin transactions in red. Litecoin's the only chain that shows this growth, right, from substitution. And naturally, this has been the only thing driving Litecoin transactional growth. So as users get priced out of Bitcoin, you see Litecoin grow in transaction activity, and it sticks, right? People don't go back to BTC after they've been priced out. This is common in other markets as well, right? Other social media networks, once users are on a certain network like Facebook or Instagram, they're not going to leave for something else unless there's something that forces them. They're banned or censored off the platform. This next chart is from BitPay. It shows that Litecoin's the most commonly used for transactions here. Now, I don't have the chart that shows average order value, but naturally, like we were talking about before, most of these transactions are for lower value payments. I think the average order value used for Litecoin is about $70, $60-$70, whereas for Bitcoin it's $1,200-$1,300. What is important here, though, is that Litecoin's not just being used most for payments, it's also being used for payout transactions. So that means people are starting to hold on to Litecoin, and this is how money naturally emerges over time. At first, it's utility, right? With Bitcoin, even early on, people were like, you should use Bitcoin to buy stuff on Silk Road or buy stuff or gamble on a poker site, but then convert to dollars because you don't want to hold your money in this volatile currency. And then the store value property eventually emerged. People wonder, if I'm going to convert my dollars to Bitcoin and then use it on this platform, why am I going to convert back to dollars? Well, the same thing is happening now between Bitcoin and Litecoin. People say save in Bitcoin, spend your altcoins, but eventually you get to the point where, hey, Bitcoin fees are going to be 10, 50, 100, $400. Why would I hold on to Bitcoin and not just hold on to Litecoin because I'm going to spend it anyways? These next two charts are from CoinGate and Bitrefill, and I present these just because this isn't just a unique phenomenon happening on BitPay in the United States. It's happening globally. So Litecoin's seeing relative market share among total users on these platforms, not just in one jurisdiction, but really it's happening globally. So to summarize these last few sections, the data we're looking at definitely does have high integrity from median transaction values as well as being confirmed by the popular payment processors in multiple jurisdictions all around the world. Litecoin monetization is growing at low value ranges like we would expect, but this process can continue to happen at mid-value ranges and eventually high value ranges if the Bitcoin fee level, meaning Bitcoin demand, increases. So it's transitioning from a utility-driven medium of exchange to a more dominant store of value. That narrative hasn't really emerged yet in the speculative market. Narratives are lagging indicators. So let's conclude this video. If you've made it this far, thank you. I know this was longer, but I felt that all the information that was presented throughout these slides is important. And so thanks if you made it through the whole video here. Let's conclude. So we left off the previous video stating that Bitcoin cannot scale through vertical layers or custodians. It's not evident yet in the casino market, and the narrative still doesn't exist because Bitcoin isn't a threat to the state's monetary monopoly. But as soon as it does become a threat, if people are rejecting dollars for Bitcoin, the state loses tax revenue, and then they finally have an incentive. And any company or custodian within their jurisdiction is vulnerable to political capture, potential confiscation, regulation, and really deleting the Bitcoin value prop from any regulated institution. So it can't scale that way. It scales horizontally through substitution. We've identified that Litecoin's the second Bitcoin chain really to emerge out of this market because one chain alone can't handle the monetary demand. So the market scales horizontally. It can keep happening over and over again. Litecoin's just the most obvious next chain in line to be monetized. And it's done so out of necessity, not by marketing. There's almost no influencers, no central figurehead of Litecoin, just like Bitcoin early on. But it's holding its own, at least on the monetary side. And once the speculative market realizes the truth about this, we will see the emergence of leaders and people speculating on the chain, just like with Bitcoin and Michael Saylor. So now that we've identified Litecoin being the second Bitcoin chain to be monetized, I want to talk about this speculative opportunity in the next video. So as this dynamic of substitution accelerates into the mid-value range, if Bitcoin demand increases, Litecoin's role will expand, and it will start to steal Bitcoin's speculative premium, meaning eventually, because people are motivated to buy Bitcoin because they think price will go up, as soon as it falters because it's only driven by speculation and it takes more and more money to move it higher, eventually Litecoin's natural monetary growth will force a re-understanding of Bitcoin by the speculative market, and it's vulnerable to a rapid repricing. So in the next video, we'll dive deep into modeling this repricing, how and why Litecoin will steal Bitcoin's store value and speculative market share. So thank you guys for the attention. Again, I know this was long, but For more information, you can follow me at WLitecoin or on YouTube at the Litecoin Forecast. And then stay tuned for the book titled Why Everyone's Wrong About Bitcoin that I'm planning to release after the editing process is finished. Thanks again. See you all in the next video.